On the 23rd of August, 1305, a crowd gathered in the heart of London. They weren't there for a coronation. They weren't there for a festival. They were there to watch a man die, slowly, deliberately, and in a way designed to erase him from history. His name was William Wallace. Hollywood gave you a blue-faced warrior screaming for freedom. But the real story is stranger, bloodier, and far more political than any film could capture. This is not the legend. This is what the parchment, the court records, and the chroniclers actually left behind, and why England didn't just want Wallace dead. They wanted him unmade. To understand why Wallace's death was so extreme, you have to understand the chaos that came before it. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland died in a riding accident on a stormy night near Kinghorn. He left no adult heir, only a 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, living across the sea. When Margaret herself died in 1290, sailing to claim her throne, Scotland was left with no monarch at all, and more than a dozen rival claimants. This was the vacuum Edward I of England stepped into. Edward, later remembered as Hammer of the Scots, was invited to arbitrate the succession. He chose John Balliol as king. But Edward had no intention of letting Scotland stay independent. He treated Balliol as a puppet, humiliated him publicly, and eventually forced him to abdicate. By 1296, Edward had invaded outright. Scottish nobles were forced to sign the ragman roll, swearing fealty to the English crown. Scotland, on paper, had ceased to rule itself. This is the world William Wallace was born into. Not a fantasy of painted warriors, but a country under military occupation, its nobility humiliated, its king a hostage in England. We actually know very little about Wallace's early life, and that gap is exactly what later storytellers filled with legend. He was likely born in the 1270s, probably in Renfrewshire or Ayrshire, to a family of minor gentry. Not peasants, as folklore later suggested, but not high nobility either. He would have been trained to fight, likely literate, and raised in a Scotland already simmering under English pressure. The first confirmed historical record of Wallace is from May 1297, the killing of William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark. Chronicles differ on the reason. Some say it was revenge for the killing of a woman connected to Wallace. Others frame it purely as rebellion. What's certain is this: from that moment, Wallace became a wanted man and a rallying point. Within months, he was leading armed bands, striking English garrisons, and linking up with other resistance leaders, most notably Andrew Moray in the north. On September 11th, 1297, Wallace and Moray achieved the impossible. At Stirling Bridge, a narrow wooden crossing over the River Forth, thousands of English troops, cavalry included, tried to funnel across in a bottleneck. Wallace and Moray waited until a large portion of the English force had crossed, then struck. Trapped between the river and the Scottish line, the English were slaughtered. Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's hated treasurer in Scotland, was killed in the battle, and according to several chronicles, his body was mutilated afterward, his skin reportedly taken as a grim trophy. It was a devastating, humiliating defeat for England, one of the few times in this era that a mostly infantry Scottish force broke an English army outright. Wallace was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. For a brief window, he was the most powerful man in the country. But Stirling Bridge also sealed his fate. Andrew Moray died of wounds from the battle. Wallace was now the singular face of Scottish resistance, and Edward I would not forget the humiliation. Edward returned to Scotland personally in 1298, determined to erase the memory of Stirling Bridge. At the Battle of Falkirk that July, Wallace commanded Scottish spearmen arranged in schiltrons, dense circular formations of long spears, built to repel cavalry charges. Tactically, it worked. English horsemen broke against the formations. But Edward had something Wallace couldn't counter: massed Welsh and English longbowmen, who tore the tightly packed schiltrons apart from a distance before the cavalry finished the job. Falkirk was a catastrophe. Wallace escaped with his life, but his authority didn't survive the battle. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland within months. For the next several years, historical records go quiet. Some accounts place him in France, possibly seeking support from the French king, possibly meeting with the Pope's representatives. What's clear is that Scotland's other nobles began negotiating their own peace with Edward. Wallace refused. That refusal is what set him apart, and what made him unforgivable in Edward's eyes. While Scottish lords like Robert the Bruce made their separate peace with England, some more than once, Wallace remained an outlaw by choice. He would not submit, would not swear fealty, would not be bought. For Edward, this was intolerable. A king who had subdued nearly all of Scotland's nobility couldn't tolerate one commoner-born knight who simply would not kneel. Wallace became priority target number one, hunted for years by English agents and Scottish collaborators alike. On August 5, 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow. The man widely blamed is John de Menteith, a Scottish knight in English service, remembered in later tradition, fairly or not, as a betrayer of his own countrymen. Wallace was bound and transported swiftly to London, covering the journey in a matter of days, as if Edward feared even a moment's delay might let his enemy slip away again. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought before a tribunal at Westminster Hall. Call it a trial if you like, but it was theater with a predetermined verdict. He was crowned mockingly with a garland of oak leaves, a jab at his reputation as an outlaw of the forests. He was charged with treason, among other crimes, including atrocities allegedly committed against civilians. Wallace's response, according to tradition, was simple and devastating. He could not be a traitor to Edward, because he had never once sworn allegiance to him. He was a subject of Scotland, not England. It didn't matter. There was no jury, no real defense offered, no chance of acquittal. Within hours, sentence was passed. And that sentence was designed not just to kill him, but to make an example so grotesque that no future rebel would dare follow his path. Here is what actually happened. Not softened, not stylized. Wallace was dragged, not carried, dragged, through the streets of London tied to the tail of a horse, over several miles, from Westminster to the Tower, and then on to Smithfield. The public humiliation was the first act of the punishment. At Smithfield, he was hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. This was the deliberate cruelty of the sentence. Death by hanging was not permitted to finish its work. While still conscious, he was castrated and disemboweled, his entrails burned before his eyes. Only after this was he beheaded. His body was then quartered, cut into 4 pieces. Each piece was sent to a different city, reportedly Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, displayed publicly as a warning to anyone else who might resist English rule. His head was set on a spike on London Bridge, where the heads of enemies of the crown were traditionally displayed for the crowds and river traffic to see. This was the full sentence for high treason in medieval England, hanging, drawing, and quartering, and Wallace is among its most infamous victims. It wasn't random brutality. It was a calculated political message, broadcast across Scotland in pieces of a man's own body. This is what defiance costs. Here's the twist Edward never saw coming. The scattering of Wallace's remains, meant to erase him, to turn his body into a scattered warning, did the opposite. It turned him into a martyr whose story could be told in every city that received a piece of him. Within a decade, Robert the Bruce, once one of the nobles who'd made peace with England, would lead Scotland to its own decisive victory at Bannockburn in 1314, eventually securing recognition of Scottish independence. Edward I never lived to see it. He died in 1307, reportedly still obsessed with subduing Scotland, 2 years after ordering the death meant to end the rebellion for good. Braveheart gave the world a warrior in blue paint, screaming a word he probably never said. But the true story needs no embellishment. A minor Scottish knight refused to kneel to the most powerful king in Britain, and paid for it with one of the most brutal executions in recorded history. They didn't just want William Wallace dead. They wanted him gone, scattered, silenced, forgotten. Instead, they made him immortal.